last like 6 months of the year, we partnered with the Rental Housing Association of Washington on a weekly segment that has to do with the absolute disaster that's happening when it comes to evictions and landlord-tenant laws and all of this. And yeah, to some people it's like, that seems pretty obvious, that you're kind of pushing their agenda. We are 100%. I agree with everything that they are doing and saying about the backward nature of the landlord-tenant laws. And we want to bring more attention to it. We're going to continue to do it going into the new year. And here's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about doing that. I mean, we got into these stories that we were covering like last year and early this year about some of these landlords put in insane, unwinnable situations, like Jason Roth in Seattle, who had a guy who had plenty of money, was taking pictures on yachts and vacations, but wouldn't pay him rent because he could get away with not paying him rent. And there was eviction moratorium, so he could get away with not paying rent and still living in Jason Roth's house. So that got us really fired up about these issues. And then, of course, Jaskaran Singh in Bellevue, who's got a beautiful rental home, and he's got a guy living there who makes plenty of money, who can pay rent, but for 2.5 years he has not. And he's been delaying and delaying and delaying because the system helps him do that. And this is one of those things where it's so ridiculous that it has to be intentional, right? It's so ridiculous that it has to be intentional. So there's a story out of the Washington State Standard that, one of the reasons, and what I was saying is that we partnered with RHA is obviously they're an advertiser on our show, but it's because of news stories like this. Like, we need to do and focus more on these landlord-tenant stories because the media covers them like this. So this is from the Washington State Standard. Insanity. So the headline, eviction filings around Washington soar to record high levels. It says Washington is on track to have more eviction filings this year than any other year on record. 9 counties, including King and Spokane, hit new high marks, and 7 others are on their way. So in this, they talk to an expert named Tim Thomas. He's the research director at the University of California, Berkeley's Urban Displacement Project. And he kind of talks about this phenomenon up and down the entire West Coast where evictions are just soaring. The Standard says, this is a quote from Tim Thomas, "The state is in an eviction crisis at this point," he said. Washington's policies, like its right to counsel program, have helped keep some of these people from becoming homeless. But he said without more action and funding, evictions will rise further. So you've got this guy, California, Berkeley, talking about we're in an eviction crisis, not just here in California and in Washington State. The right to counsel program that we have, he said, is at least keeping some of these people from becoming homeless. So the right to counsel is a program that's funded with your taxpayer money that basically says tenants who are dealing with eviction proceedings, the taxpayers will foot the bill for their legal defense. Landlords are just screwed. They got to foot the bill for their own legal defense because they're rich people bad, right? It goes on to say that Thomas said one way the state can attempt to manage the record number of evictions is to what? There's a theme here, guys. Expand its right to counsel program, which he called a really powerful policy counterbalancing the crisis and keeping people housed. The Office of Civil Legal Aid, which runs this, is asking state lawmakers for $8.8 million in the next 2-year budget cycle. Let me keep going, but you understand the point I'm about to make. More from the Washington State Standard. Along with continuing to fund the right to counsel program, lawmakers will likely look at other policy solutions to ease the growing wave of evictions. Financial assistance to tenants and landlords, caps on certain rent increases, and improving access to social services could all be on the table when they return in January. So here's a story, and it's a lengthy news story. It's not a flyby news story. It's a lengthy news story talking about this insane rise in evictions. Nowhere in the entire story does it talk about the laws and policies that have gone into place, not only at the state level, but even more so in places like Spokane County and King County, that have led to the eviction crisis we're dealing with today. They have made it nearly impossible for landlords to be able to properly screen tenants, to make sure the tenants are going to be good, reliable tenants, that they are going to follow the rules and the laws, that they're going to take good care of the property, that they're going to be able to pay. Because all that stuff is like racist, right, and discriminatory. The first in time, where you've got to take the first person who's qualified who comes to you. and rent them a unit. So the government has stripped private landowners, landlords, and property owners of the ability to properly vet the people who are renting their units. So it's really no surprise that they get stuck with a lot of deadbeat tenants, like the ones we just discussed in Seattle and Bellevue, who are abusing the system to be able to stay in their units without paying rent as long as they possibly can. And then when the long clock is finally up, they get free legal counsel. So they can prolong things even more. And at that point, you haven't paid rent in a year or 2 years. And now actually the burden on you is so great if you do get kicked out or if you do have some sort of ruling where you've got to pay back rent, that it's really no surprise that you'd end up homeless when you've got $40,000 in back rent. Not to mention the fact that during the pandemic, also something that really wasn't touched on in the way that it should have been in this story, you had eviction moratoriums. And the eviction moratoriums were all inclusive. No one had to show or prove that they had a financial need to not pay rent, that they had lost a job, that they'd been laid off, that they couldn't work in some way because of the pandemic, that they had a sick family member that couldn't work. No requirement to prove need to not pay rent. So you had people who they were totally able to pay rent. They just didn't want to. They found that the system, if they could abuse it in that way, they'd be able to do so. And it's no wonder that when eviction moratoriums finally end, you had this huge rush of evictions. So none of that's the problem. None of those things, not even mentioned in the article, not even mentioned by the news. All of these laws that have been put in place that stick landlords with less than ideal tenants, that they eventually have to evict because you've loosened standards so much. And that is why across the West Coast, in very blue progressive areas that have done much of the same things, you have a rise in evictions, a record number of evictions. But in this entire news story, all they talk about, the only people they platform are the California Berkeley researcher who says, we need to do things like make sure that these tenants have more access to free taxpayer-funded legal services so they can stay in these homes without paying rent as long as possible. And then they also quote Democratic politicians who, we've got to do something about this. This is untenable. Never question the Democratic politicians. Well, have you thought about whether some of the policies that you've put in place have led to these evictions and have led to less than ideal landlord-tenant relationships? No, none of that. And they ended with, along with continuing to fund to the tune of $8.8 million in the budget crisis, the Right to Counsel program, lawmakers are also going to look at other policy solutions to ease the growing wave of evictions, like caps on certain rent increases. How is capping rent going to ease the backlog of evictions? Because the media is under the same mindset as politicians that this all has to do with greedy landlords who are charging too much for rent, and the only people who aren't paying rent are the people who are being screwed over by big greedy landlords or who are down on their luck financially. And we just need to help them out for a little bit. There might be a few people like that, but we know that that's not what's going on here. So this is how the media covers these landlord-tenant issues. No interest in telling the full story, in giving a complete picture. No interest in talking about the danger of rent caps, of rent control. So not only is that going to lead, then evictions won't be a problem. People won't have a place to live, because if you cap rent, so many of these landlords, especially small to mid-sized landlords, are just going to sell their units altogether, and they're going to be sold as homes for families. So then you're going to have a totally new crisis on your hands. It's going to feed into the homeless crisis that's already bad because you already can't handle it. But this is what the media does. And it's so disappointing to see. I like some of the stuff the Washington State Standard has been doing. But stories like this, literally no critical thought about the sequence of events that has led us to an eviction crisis. They've just manufactured in their mind that, it's about landlord greed and people just can't afford to pay rent. God, it is really, really getting bad. Anyway, so we're going to continue our partnership with the Rental Housing Association into the new year to talk about some of these issues, especially as they come up during the legislative session. If you are a small to mid-sized landlord, you got to have somebody who's going to stand up for you. Don't try to navigate the situation alone. You can become a member of RHA, rhawa.org, rhawa.org.